Again.
What did you fuck up?
I still haven't gotten rid of the 20-second delay.
Oh,
I mean, it's fine.
all right.
It's not gonna make the stream
So,
unwatchable, but yeah, it's
so when the stream is online, what we're saying right now will probably be in it.
yeah,
I noticed that. That's fine.
yeah,
But
it's fine. But we're definitely
so
live already.
all right. So hey everybody,
Oh
how you
hi.
guys doing? Yeah, we were So for those of you who were watching last Wednesday or Tuesday, whichever day that it was, that we did our midweek back alley episode last week, we were supposed to have Radical Reviewer on, and we had Radical Reviewer on the midweek stream last week, and it was a good time, though I got the impression that he was like trying to, from his perspective, play it safe, which is unfortunate because I was trying to go for actually having constructive discussion, sort of the idea behind that format. But anyway, he was supposed to show up this week, and he's not online right now. He might show up in the middle of the stream. Got plenty of time for it. But for those of you who are wondering why he's not here currently, um, yeah, so we he's not online right now. Long story short, but that doesn't mean that we aren't going to respond to the video, because whether or not he's here, I still really wanted to respond to the video that I was planning on responding to with him on the stream.
Yeah, it's slightly different than what we usually talk about, both in the older commentary videos and on this stream, because well, we don't really go after conservatards all that much, which is really unfortunate because well, not only are they, I don't know if it qualifies as low hanging fruit or not, but it is definitely it's definitely worth examining. And I thought that Radical Reviewer would be very interested in going after this kind of thing because he's kind of like the conservatards have kind of always been a thing that he goes after, and so it would have been, I think, pretty interesting to get his perspective on this shenanigan.
Well, specifically, it is a like PragerU conservatard video attempting to defend a quote unquote free market policy, which we'll get to that for sure. Um, and I think that obviously he would have many objections, but they would, and incidentally enough, we also would be very critical of the sort of conservative defense of that issue, mainly because it's not actually a defense of free markets, and it's actually kind of harmful for the case against statism, because um, you know they oftentimes attribute things which really can't be considered free to free association, like various forms of intervention, or just the idea of a political economy itself prescribing rates of interest, or trying to engineer incentives through fiat being described as free market policies, quote unquote.
Hmm.
Yeah,
This,
so it falls into the same category of video that we were responding to last week, where we shared the conclusion that it would have been a bad video, but we would have had competing arguments for why what's being presented in the video we're responding to is not valid. And I thought that would have been interesting. But I guess, regardless, like I was saying a moment ago, even though he's not here, I think it'll still be interesting to to combat this type of video, considering that you see a lot of the same issues with like the sort of political libertarian crowd, where there's this idea, if you change the rates at which, if the government changes the rates at which certain groups of people are taxed, then that somehow moves you closer to freedom.
We'll save that argument for when we get to it, because what
Yeah,
you're
for
going to
sure.
find is that, well, at least in my understanding, is that they're trying to co-opt the term free. They're trying to co-opt free market in order to promote people back into political thinking, into partyarchy politics, and to get people to vote for their particular candidate. Yeah, you should believe in free markets, and the only way we can achieve free market is by voting for Donald Trump, because Trump is 100% the free market candidate, I promise. And you know why he's
And
a free
so,
market candidate? Because his name has an R enclosed in parentheses next to his name. We can't have those D's with the parentheses next to their name and power, because otherwise they'll enact literal communism.
yeah,
I've
as
always wanted to
and
do that.
all right.
Sorry.
Yeah, I might clip that for the video I'm putting together. Yeah, as though free association is something that can be like prescribed onto society, as opposed to just what exists in the absence of these proprietary institutions like the state, cartelizing our assets and trying to induce artificial scarcity uh, in in the process.
It's two competing sets of structuralist interpretations of how society ought to be structured and ought to be organized. The thing about it is that once you recognize it and you get yourself out of that structuralist way of thinking, it's pretty easy to see them as they actually are. Just two competing ideas, or two competing top down authoritarian structures, all trying to essentially plan and organize society. It's there's really not much to say about it. It gets pretty boring after a while, honestly. It's also very interesting to watch people, especially in the run up to the election, since that's like less than 2 weeks away. That people are starting to get very hyped up about it. I have people in real life now asking me if I voted yet, because there's early voting, mail-in voting, that sort of thing, and people are really concerned about if I put my vote in for the right guy, the right lying sociopath who is going to help engineer utopia from the top down. I mean, it's also kind of unfortunate because people don't realize that they themselves are the hope that they are waiting for. I don't know.
Yeah,
There's a
yeah. I was just gonna say that. Yeah, I haven't spoken to like any in my real life. I haven't really spoken to anybody who's particularly invested in politics. That's a good thing about living counter economically, is that it doesn't, even though you associate with people who have varying views on society, it doesn't, not only does it not really affect you because you're so disassociated from the legal market, that regardless of what the state tries to do, it has like it has almost no impact on you. But on top of that, it's very easy to sort of shut those people, to shut out the sort of political narratives by just not watching Fox News. And it's, we were talking about this last night in the Discord server. It's almost therapeutic because you never realize until you embrace a sort of anti-political, a truly anti-political understanding of society, the extent to which that mentality is absolutely screwing with your psyche by causing, for one example, causing you to look at everybody who has even remotely different personal interests than you as your enemy rather than somebody that you might be able to cooperate with for mutual benefits.
I mean, I've personally experienced this anxiety as early as 2012 and probably even 2008, though my memory from that far back is a little more spotty. Where 2012 and 2010 and 2014, and I'm pretty sure if you were to go back further, you could find examples of people putting forward this narrative. Just insert election cycle here are the most important elections in American history. And if we don't vote the correct way, then everything is just going to be death and misery and fire and brimstone. And it's just going to suck really bad, even though it's really just hyperbolic rhetoric to just scare people into believing that their set of lying sociopaths who want to essentially plan society are somehow going to be even more correct. Which, I mean, it showcases very clearly like how desperate the state is to vote. I mean, I see Black Spruce in the comments just a few minutes ago pointing out how on Fur Affinity, a furry porn site, because let's be honest, that's what it is, has
But
has been sending users messages about how they should get out and vote. And I think the owner of that site actually even did so on their Twitter account as well. The point is that, yeah, the whole thing is it's kind of gotten ridiculous. And it also showcases the extent to which political libertarians, in their attempt to get people to vote for Joe Jorgensen or whoever, are fundamentally misguided. Because if the vote were as subversive as people actually make it out to be, then why would the state be promoting it? It just doesn't really add up. But it actually does, because once you understand why the state wants people to vote, it makes a lot more sense. Which is to say, it gets people to act in ways that make their interests impossible without state power. Because if you're voting, it means that you're trying to get the government to act in certain ways. And if you're trying to get the government to act in certain ways, it means that what you're trying to do is unachievable without using the force and violence of the state to coerce other people into doing what you want. Because government, in one word, is violence. It's a bit of a gross oversimplification, but it does showcase the extent to which your incentives are fundamentally distorted by simple association with the state. Because, well, the state is really completely different than any kind of other social interaction that you could ever engage in. It's fundamentally parasitical and can never be consensual. For example, like theft can be consensual. It's gift giving. Rape can be consensual. That's just love making. But in the form of social interaction, which is statism, which is to say, getting a victim to fund their own oppression, how is that
rape
ever going to be? How is that ever going to be consensual?
rape can be consensual. Filthy heretic, 2020.
How?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's also another very important nuance to take into consideration there as well. Uh, just aside from an ethical standpoint, there's tangibly a difference between how the state works and how any other model works. That doesn't mean that they necessarily have competing interests. It does mean that if we're going to look at like the things that they will do to try and sustain themselves, or sort of what interests they have to sustain themselves, then we have to treat them differently than any other sort of productive actor, because that's the thing with the state. The state, the only tool that the state has is to use violence, because the state doesn't start with any assets, and even if it does start with assets, because it's a monopoly, and the state's goal is to try to consolidate as many parts of society as possible, either into itself or to have them loosely partnered with itself. Um, they will never be productive because they don't because whether or not people are like giving are actually contributing with their own like individual inputs. So whether or not they're actually telling the state what their interests are by associating with them is irrelevant information to the state's model of operation, because the state can just take whatever it wants, and the state can just sort of engineer these structures which force people into these ways of associating by limiting their options down to a very narrow set of possibilities. So when we look at the state, it's fundamentally wrong, even from a a studious standpoint, to try and equate the state with a firm that produces things to try and sell them on the market.
Hmm. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty hyped up at the moment. I'm warmed up, and I think I've woken up actually quite a bit since the stream started, so I'm ready to start the video. You?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
I wouldn't say that I'm awake, but I definitely am more awake than I was earlier.
excellent. So, anyways, let's get this cancer started.
Take a close look at this.
Whoa. Yeah.
Take a close look at this. Jonathan Haidt, the noted New York University psychologist.
I thought you were gonna mute yourself when the thing started playing.
Oh yeah, sorry about that.
Jonathan Haidt, the noted New York University psychologist, calls it the most important graph in the world. Why does he say that? Because he knows this graph reveals a simple, inescapable fact. There is no substitute for free market capitalism as a promoter of human prosperity.
Uh, it's. I mean, if you take out the word free market capitalism and just replace it with free markets, this is going to be absolutely true. But it goes without saying that this graph does not demonstrate that because, well, other than a few blips in history, we've never really had free markets in human history. Plus, the graph doesn't really showcase the point that they're even trying to make. It really showcases the shift in in the forms of economic organization and how it's able to increase GDP, which I don't think we need to get into GDP at the moment because they're going to explain that in just a little bit. But suffice to say that the terminology that they're using, as well as the information that they're showing off right now, is incredibly misleading. I think this is now a pretty decent point to talk about why we think capitalism is a term that ought to be eschewed by not only us, but just about everyone, everywhere.
Yeah, you could go ahead
Yes, yeah,
if
sure.
you want.
So I like what Roderick Long said about it, and that is you have, depending on who you ask, you're going to get two completely different definitions of capitalism. You have, of course, the supporters of markets who say that capitalism is just when people exchange, and then you have socialists, communists, generally people who are a lot more like authoritarian collectivists, who are going to say that it's a form of it's a private ownership of the means of production like what we have today. And so those are two pretty mutually exclusive ideas, since what we have today is most certainly not a free market, and there are also instances in which industry is not owned by private ownership. In fact, in many places, especially in other countries, you have industry that is outright owned by the state and publicly owned, in addition to many industries in the US that are nominally privately owned, but are under such heavy restriction and control and dominion by the state that they basically have de facto dominion over it. A good example would
Well,
be the healthcare, banking, and nuclear energy industries, which are so heavily controlled and restricted that oftentimes regulators will often just invent regulations that literally only apply to that particular firm just to see what the results are. They made these industries literally petri dishes for their own grandiose central planning ideas. In addition to the fact that, well, their control is so restrictive that a regulator can demand when an employee is allowed to take a piss, where they're allowed to take a piss, and in which direction.
well, and what I was going to say previously is that there's also a more fundamental problem we were hinting at a moment ago with the idea that an economy is something that's prescribed by the state, or that the interests of actors within that society are prescribed by the legal infrastructure of the market, because that's more or less what the state's influence on society is. Now, as I was talking about earlier, the only real effect that legislation has, nobody would argue that the state issuing legislative decrees, so making threats and then enforcing those threats with the use of violence, um, nobody would argue that that's productive, because only one side benefits, and one side benefits explicitly at the destruction or exploitation of the other side. So, that's what we would consider to be a parasitic exchange fundamentally. So, the other issue with this, though, is, well, the more fundamental issue, I guess, would be that is sort of what your view of society or markets are, like what informs this approach to studying markets or societies. And if you're starting from this assumption, well, there are a couple big holes that we could poke into this type of study right away. Firstly, there's the existence of gray and black markets. Now, I'm not necessarily, citing their existence is, not necessarily me making the case in and of itself, for counter economics. But what it does, even though I would argue that's something you all should go out and do, but the fact that counter economies exist, it demonstrates that within even the area or the means of trade that the state tries to engineer through these legislative schemes, even with all of that, all that they're really fundamentally doing is engineering incentives by limiting people's options. So what they're not actually prescribing the interests that people operate around, or like prescribing what exists. They're limiting the ability for people to use what exists, or the ways that they can use what exists. And fact of the matter is that trade and models of association which don't conform to what the state is trying to engineer for them will still, that sort of trade will still exist. And because of that, any figure of accounting that the state creates, or any of these sorts of like outlets that people trade through, which are established in the state's legal infrastructure, will never be able to account for all the trade that occurs. And as a result, I don't really know how you could argue that economies are prescribed by the state. And that's not even getting into, the more fundamental issues. Like, if we were to look at economies this way, it would imply that on paper markets would be able to exist even though literally not a single person is trading in them, because it's just measuring GDP. So if the state breaks enough windows, then you have GDP increasing. If the state breaks windows and then uses some of the resources that they confiscated from people to fix those windows, you have an increase of GDP occurring there.
Yeah, and just back to the point that I was going to make about capitalism, because I realized I kind of ended that without finishing up my point. It's that
Okay.
the term capitalism is used to refer to contradictory phenomena, and it's very difficult to even evaluate which one of these claims as to what the term capitalism means is actually accurate. The only conclusion we can make is that either all of them are accurate, some of them are accurate, none of them are accurate, and with no way to know, I mean, it's really hard to even nail down what the definition of capitalism is, other than the fact that it's presented as though, as you said earlier, it was some kind of top down imposed system of state mandated trade or state mandated exchange, which of course strongly implies that nobody is ever capable of making any economic exchange at any point without getting the permission of some bureaucrat to be able to do so, or possibly without some bureaucrat instructing them how to do so, because the state is just great and wonderful and wise, and they just tell everyone how to do things, much like in the same way that before governments, nobody was ever allowed to speak anything ever because we needed the government to tell us how to use free speech. But anyways, the whole point is that capitalism is an anti-concept. It's utterly worthless as an idea, and it's only used for the purposes of obfuscating conversation. If you yourself, yeah,
A heretic, what you're arguing is not incompatible with capitalism, because capitalism is just whenever people do anything ever.
oh right. Well, in that case, it just means that it's a parameter without, or it's a term without parameters, which means it can be described. It can be used to describe literally anything, which at that point the
Yeah.
term is still worthless because, well, to quote Syndrome from The Incredibles, if everything is capitalism, or to go into the Hoppian term, if everything is covenant communities, then nothing is. But
Yeah.
yeah, the point is that when Marxists and just general collectivist authoritarians want or use the term capitalism in a very loose manner without defining their terms, it's not only them that are using it to mislead and confuse people. It's also conservatards like this who like to use capitalism as a buzzword, but all it really does is confuse people because the Marxists hear it and hear a completely different thing than what the conservatards mean when they say it, and neither of them are going to be correct fundamentally because, well, there's no way to prove what the term actually means, and there's no real descriptive
There's nothing,
value in the term. It's
there's
worthless.
nothing
It's
there's nothing that you could demonstrate in capitalism itself. What capitalism is doing is describing a set of principles, and it describes so many of them that they not only oftentimes conflict with one another, but they also, that also, as Heretic was saying, obfuscates our ability to understand what's even being spoken about.
Now, if you're in the audience and you still identify with the term capitalism, I imagine that by capitalism you're referring to free markets. And so, with this in mind, I would very much implore you. I can't force you to do anything, of course, but I would just strongly recommend that you refer to yourself using the term free market, or even better yet, freed markets. And I would emphasize freed because it implies that that in the term freed market, it implies that the market that we currently have is not free, which is of course an accurate representation of the quasi-fascist market economy that we have today.
Also, I mean, it goes beyond just the the descriptive value of capitalism itself. At least my criticism of the notion does. What I was referring to earlier, the idea of a economy that's prescribed as opposed to being an emergent factor of people associating with one another and evaluating their own interests. That's sort of implied in the concept of capitalism, because capitalism is describing a prescribed economic system. I think in that regard, an actual Austrian free marketer would have to consider themselves, I guess, quote unquote, an anti-capitalist, because the Austrian conclusion is fundamentally rejecting the notion that it's legitimate to see economies as something ascribed by political fiat. The other problem, though, is that in an actual stateless market society, there not everything would be exclusively owned, because there would be resources that attempting to claim exclusive ownership over them would entail the active use of aggression against other people and their property. For instance, if you were to try and claim all the roads around someone else's house. So even if you were to try and, take the description capitalism at face value, a system where everything is privately owned, I don't think that a market anarchy could aptly be described that way.
Mm-hmm. Because of course you're going to find a whole bunch of properties, say like worker co-ops, that are owned by a whole bunch of people cooperatively. You can probably have syndicates, and there's also going to be instances of communistic societies where everything is owned by members of that community. Now, just to reply to something that Kojal said in the comments, where he doesn't want to give ground to communists on the term capitalist, you're not really giving you're not giving grounds to the communists at all. You're just using more accurate terminology to more accurately represent your views. You're not giving ground to anyone.
It's not giving Marxist ground. If anything, that's making it more difficult for them to argue their position.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're clarifying specifically what you're arguing when you argue for a free society. You're making that more clear. So their idea of, oh, well, you want like Reaganite neoliberalism, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, they can't pull that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Because if anything, your critique of the political economy is even more radical than theirs is.
Mm-hmm. And Night Watchman says that he misses when I did normal videos. I don't know what normal means, but don't worry, I got a video in the works. It'll be done probably in the next few days, although I meant to record it yesterday and I didn't get the time to get around to it. I'm sorry. But yeah, the point is that funnily enough, you use the term freed markets and you put the communists on the position of having to defend either the status quo of unfreed markets or just having to reject markets entirely. But it's pretty good to take away like one of their most useful tools in their toolbox, which is of course this straw man ridiculous idea of this straw man of capitalism that they like to use and throw around, that really only applies to Hoppians.
Well, and the other interesting thing that deconstructing the idea of like a political economy does is that it takes away the Marxist ability to, or either side of the quote unquote political spectrum's ability to point to a specific model of organization and say, that's what I'm arguing for. Because when the political economy is gone, anybody could start up that model of organization, and if it's sustainable, if people want to associate with them, then there's not only are you not actually harming anyone else or infringing upon their rights, but on top of that, you could argue that even from their economic perspective, economics no longer becomes a battle between factors that are trying to aggress upon one another. It instead becomes a competition of whose model is more profitable or whose model is more beneficial to which interests. And pursuing those interests doesn't necessarily conflict with another person. So, in other words, if a statist conservative, a Marxist, or anybody who is, arguing for a sort of political economy comes along to try and argue with that position, it gets rid of the obfuscation that existed previously entirely, because you're not even necessarily arguing against whatever model that they're proposing. What you're arguing against becomes just the initiation of force, and it puts them in a position where that is inescapably what they're arguing. So they can't say, well, we just want programs to help the poor people. No, 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 motherfucker. You are arguing for the use of violence, because I don't necessarily disagree that you could in a free society create a model that could do that, or you could think up a model that could do that. We have some surprises coming out with FNet in that regard, but yeah. So what you're arguing is not that poor people should have a safety net. What you're arguing is that people should be coerced into funding a specific model of organization.
Mm-hmm. And if you don't conform to our specific model of organization, then you're just a subversive and you need to be thrown in jail. But anyways, we went on this for like 20 minutes. Should we get on to the next part?
Back to I guess to the original point that that Prager was making here. Well, it's not Prager speaking, but Prager you. Well, what's actually being observed is not the influence of quote unquote free markets. It's the transition between the mercantilist model and the current political economic model, which it doesn't mean necessarily that we live in a free society now, but we didn't then. That's obviously just regime propaganda. No, it just means that it's more productive than the previous model, and that's the other question: productive for whom?
Mm-hmm.
Well, for the state's political economic actors. We might have more resources because of it, sure, but that doesn't mean we're free with those resources, because ultimately the state still decides what people can or can't do with them. If the state's going to aggress against people, or the state's going to decide that you need to do something different with them, there's not really any recourse you have against the state. So
I'm just gonna go off on a side here. 2 comments caught my eye. One of them is Yapio. I'm not sure who that is. Hi, by the way. Said, "I destroyed you libertarians in my recent video." I don't know what that recent video is. Should I go look for it?
I don't know. Do you want to continue responding to Prager, or?
Yeah, I do. It's just that I want to see if this video is like stream material in the future.
Okay. Anybody who is going to say, "I destroyed libertarianism," I could probably hedge to bet that their video is going to be something blah blah neoliberalism, blah blah. Look at how the state defines private ownership, and look at the problems that supposedly causes, even though it's state intervention actually causing those problems. Nothing we haven't encountered before. That tends to be the reason I could tell just by like the verbiage. They destroyed libertarianism is because That tends to be like the verbiage of somebody who is more confident in themselves. And the tendency with people who are more confident in their arguments, especially since, well, we know that we're right as libertarians,
Hmm.
but the tendency with people who talk to us like that is that their arguments are very, very fucking dumb.
I just found the video, by the way. It's 50 seconds long. It's a black thumbnail, and it's called "Libertarianism in a Nutshell." Libertarianism debunked. Like, I don't know if we want to look at it
Yeah,
after
I'm
the
not
stream is
watching that
over.
on the stream.
Not right
I'm
now,
not
of
watching
course,
that on the
but
stream. It sounds like a troll video.
it honestly it kind of does. And secondly, Desert Dweller wants us to give updates on FreedomNet or FNet. There is a lot of progress being done. It's almost done, but there's nothing that we can really talk about publicly. And when we release it, you'll see why.
Yeah, the we have actually a saved state of like the oldest possible state at which FNet could be runnable on any potential operating system. But the problem and why we haven't been really updating it publicly is because actually accomplishing our goal has resulted in project itself becoming so radical compared to any sort of software parameters that currently exist. There is a realistic chance if you were to try and run it in its current state on your computer that it would brick your system. So we closed it until it's not going to destroy people's computers.
Hmm. It's
But yeah, you'll see it when it's done. What I mean by that, like it's not an unusable mess. It's actually one of the most, I would argue, radical things, but at the very least, one of the most radical pieces of software that has ever been put out, at least compared to what's currently available.
hmm and you'll see what we're talking about when it's done. But we have a very good reason to say that. However, please pardon us if we're going to be very vague on the details because this is a very tricky time, and we let's just say we have a very good reason for keeping a lid on this until it's ready to be released. And
Again,
even
you'll
afterwards, we'll probably be pretty quiet about its full capabilities.
Yeah, again, you'll see it when it's out.
Yeah, but the good news is that it's almost done. There's a very good likelihood it'll be done before the end of the month, so stay tuned for that. And anyways, let's continue the video.
Yeah.
Let it be noted that Haidt is no one's idea of a conservative. But when hard evidence stares him in the face, he's not going to look away.
Andy Puzder. And nothing really to say about that. I'm just like, I don't know who that is.
Personally, off the top of my head, I can't really tell you either. But I think that's very interesting, though. What he's arguing, GDP goes up. That means we're free.
Or he's trying to say, like, we're freer, therefore GDP goes up. Which we're going to be getting into fairly shortly, I think.
Hard evidence stares him in the face, he's not going to look away. The graph is based on the research conducted by the late British economist Angus Maddison. The numbers along the x-axis are years, 2,000 of them. The number on the y-axis are dollars, all of them, divided by the number of people on the planet. It's what's called GDP per capita, which is the world's economic output divided by its population.
Yeah, this is why I didn't want to go into the problem with GDP in the previous segment because this was going to come up.
Yeah, this is a great example of what we've been referring to earlier, where it's a terrible unit of measurement. But well, I kind of covered some of the issues with it, where if we were to assume that this is how you study economies, then markets wouldn't even have to exist in order for the economy to exist on paper, which is just I think that my point though with that is nobody would meaningfully be able to say that this is a study of markets. This is pseudoscience at best, but as I think Heretic and I have decided, and many other libertarians have kind of decisively made the case for political economies are a way of engineering incentives. And just referring to the incentives that the state has engineered as free markets is kind of gross, honestly. But it's absolutely a subversion of that concept, to say the very least.
The problem, now just to quickly review, the issue that we have with gross domestic product or GDP, well, there's several reasons. The most obvious one is that government spending is counted as is counted in GDP. It doesn't matter if the government spending is actually productive, if it ever could be hypothetically, or if it's done for any reason or whatnot. The point is that because the government is spending money at all, that this is somehow being counted as economic activity in a national scale, which I think every one of us would recognize to be absolutely ludicrous. Because if the government is spending money, we know with absolute certainty that it's being used in a less productive manner than if that had been left if it had been left to the people who actually had the money. Because as I'm sure you're aware, the only reason the government could have money at all is because it was acquired either through theft or conquest, which are more or less the same thing.
The fact that we're even the parameter that's being set for what an economy is, the fact that that's the entire national demographic area that the state is attempting to claim dominion over, attempting to claim is its nation. That in and of itself, should indicate one of the major problems with this. The What we're observing when we're looking at markets are okay. I mentioned this earlier. So again, apologize if I'm repeating myself a lot, but I over the last 48 hours, I had like 6 hours of sleep. But yeah, so one of the major problems though with that is that if we were to take that to its logical conclusion, that what makes markets a thing is an emergent property of various human actors associating with one another in pursuit of their most highly valued preferences, then it should stand to reason you can't just sort of create this aggregate and call that the economy and act as though you're measuring the interests of people in that area, because everybody in every area, well, not every area, but different neighborhoods have different economies. Every household has a different economy. Every town has a different economy, and they're going to vary wildly from one another. The economy in some backwoods Georgia town is going to be way different than the economy of a suburb in Los Angeles. So naturally, the idea of just sort of slapping this label, the economy, on this vast area is absurd on its face. That's what, we're kind of being expected, that's what we're being expected to approach this from the perspective of, assuming that this is a valid way of looking at the study of markets.
Hey, J.C. Armitage actually remarked on something that I think is particularly hilarious, and that is government spending makes you more free, which is kind of the implication that PragerU so far has made with measuring freedom according to GDP per capita, which is to say that the government spending money somehow makes people more free. And because GDP also counts things like the breaking of windows and the paying to replace them or double spending, it means that you kind of have a form of Keynesian libertarianism where you break windows for freedom. How does that sound?
Anti-Indianism. Anti-Indianism, yeah. Following this line of reasoning, yeah, you I couldn't really have any disagreements with Paul Krugman, for instance, saying that World War II ended the Great Depression, or that we should fake an alien invasion in order to try and manufacture prosperity.
Oh, that's honestly that's probably my favorite. No, my second favorite Paul Krugman moment. I'm pretty sure you can guess which one's my first.
Uh, which one is
My
your first?
my
Oh,
I
the
my IP address was hacked
yeah.
to make it look like I
Sorry,
was looking at child porn.
yeah, it took me a second to remember that, like to think of all of the things that he said. My mind jumped to that one tweet that he made. Uh, like I'm going out on my bike. Hide your girlfriend. He didn't actually say that. He made like an edit of that tweet. I'm going out on my bike. He took a picture of himself like wearing this really tight fitting t-shirt that had like a picture of Grumpy Cat on it with Donald Trump hair. So Trumpy Cat, I guess. And like short shorts, and he had like a mountain bike helmet on. And somebody made an edit of that said, "Hide your girlfriend. I'm going out." That's my favorite. Honestly, it's not even a Paul Krugman tweet, but yeah, the somebody hacked my IP address and looked up child porn on my computer was I do not I don't nobody forget that he said that. And
I
I
don't.
feel like
I won't.
it feels like that happened a while ago, but that was actually just January of this year. Feels like at least 2019, but yeah, I'm amazed that everybody just kind of fell off of everybody's radar that Paul Krugman basically like admitted to looking up child porn and like nobody said anything about it.
Well, he's got power. He's protected by the ruling class, so there's a different set of rules that apply to him. You can basically just get away with anything if you're protected.
Yeah, but I mean like even in like second stream media, people were memeing about it for a little while, but then everybody just kind of stopped talking about it.
Yeah, I couldn't possibly speculate as to what the cause of that was.
By memeing about it, I mean there was this one I thought was pretty funny. Elizabeth Warren. Uh, Somebody hacked my 23andMe profile and put DNA that was that was 1024th Cherokee in it.
Oh no, she wasn't even 1024th Cherokee. It was like the DNA test revealed that that at maximum she was 1024th South American.
And then
She wasn't even Cherokee.
Adolf Hitler on Twitter. Somebody put a bunch of Jews in concentration camps and then tried to say I did it.
God, like I love it when this kind of crap happens and people just mock them relentlessly.
Sorry that we've been like talking about this for 5 to 10 minutes, but I that should have been like a meme at least as big as like Boogie firing a warning shot. It never took off for some reason, but yeah, it was pretty great for like the week that people were talking about it.
Hmm.
Uh, anyway, I guess do you want to continue?
Yeah, let's continue.
GDP is considered the best measurement of a country's standard of living, and in this case, the world's standard of living.
Uh, considered by who?
Yeah, no comments. I think we've already thoroughly trashed that. But yeah, nobody can like GDP is the best unit of measurement for prosperity. Quote, nobody said, nobody said this ever.
In fact,
I
I've
mean,
even heard. In fact, a lot of times, even mainstream economists, when they cite GDP, will admit it's not the best, but for the purposes of what I'm trying to demonstrate, it works.
The economist who first formulated GDP, I think his name was Simon Kuznets, even said it's not a measurement that could meaningfully represent economic development.
I can see
Person
why.
who fucking, person who fucking formulated GDP
Hmm.
argued that you can't use it to measure prosperity.
I mean, you can debunk GDP per capita pretty easily by three simple words, which are often hyphenated together. And those three simple words: cost of living. It doesn't matter if your GDP per capita is $100 billion and you yourself make an income of $250 billion, because if everything costs 9 to 10 figures, then that doesn't really matter. I mean, if you were to count everything according to local currencies, then you would think countries like South Africa, Japan, would just be like absolutely prosperous because of how overvalued their currencies are.
But in reality, GDP, their GDP is so high because their central bank pretty openly buys stocks from their public corporations.
Hmm. And they're going to start starting to do that in the US and the UK as well, so expect that shortly.
But I mean, it's not the best unit for actually studying markets. It's just the one that governments like the most because it's the one that's the easiest to manipulate through government action.
Hmm. And that's the reason why it's so common among mainstream second stream sources, because those are all going to be heavily compromised by state agents, and it gives people a very false, misleading sense of the economy and how it actually works. Now, in the context of the graph that they're showing on screen, well, you said it earlier that the only reason it starts to spike around the 1700s is because that was basically the end of mercantilism, and that was when we started to really get into the industrial age. And at that point, like, once you get into those kinds of economic and productive renaissances, you're going to have exponential economic growth because that's just how it works. I'm pretty
Which
certain if you were to go back in time and see the transition from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age, that you would have seen another exponential increase in GDP as the realizations of the agricultural revolution, the first agricultural revolution, mind you, would start to become realized, and people found out that, hey, I have savings now.
for perspective, well, it's not necessarily that they realized savings was a thing in the late 1800s. I mean the late 18th century. It's just that compared to mercantilism, which for perspective, in mercantilist political economies, at the time, governments were under the impression that exporting was actually a detriment to the amount of resources that existed. So, or at least that's what they openly argued. So governments did all sorts of things in order to try and make trade within their nations as difficult as possible, like setting up as many jurisdictions as possible and making it so those jurisdictions basically have their own independent market infrastructures, so that it's as difficult as possible for them to trade among one another. So, why did GDP skyrocket after mercantilism was reformed? Like literally, because in mercantilist economies, governments basically made trade in the legal markets impossible. Doesn't mean again, that doesn't mean everybody's starved to death. It just means pretty much, if you were going to trade, that to some extent it had to be counter economic. How did governments continue sustaining themselves under mercantilism? Well, it's just that It would go invade other parts of the earth and harvest those resources.
Hmm.
And
And
pretty
another,
much the only reason that government stopped doing that is because it got to the point where there wasn't really any other land to colonize. So they a model built upon that, built upon the idea that in order to get more resources, you just have to go invade new territory. So it's gonna fall apart once you run out of new territory to invade.
hmm Now, another thing about GDP in general that I think we touched upon but didn't really get into. I mean, there is quite a bit of detail to go into, but we can also just touch on it. And that is that GDP would never count gray and black market activities. So it's not actually going to be representative of actual economic output. The the economy of the Soviet Union, for example, was significantly larger than the GDP figures made it out to be. The I put this in air quotes, by the way, trouble was that 80 to 90% of their economy was underground.
Yeah, that's what I was mentioning. That's what I was mentioning a moment ago because the sort of the state's figures for accounting necessarily will never be able to actually capture every sort of transaction that's occurring within that particular area. You're not even actually studying the markets because there are aspects of there are markets that you literally would are not able to actually take account for if you're approaching it from that perspective.
Hmm. So, anyway, should we continue?
Yeah, sure.
Often, when I show this graph to students, I get this comment: that's not capitalism. It's just the impact of the Industrial Revolution. So
Which is, I would say it's actually fairly accurate.
I mean, it depends again on what you mean by quote unquote capitalism, but yeah, the students who say that, score one for them.
Who would have thought college kids actually saying something that's remarkably accurate of things as it actually is? That's actually, I don't know what to make of that. I guess a broken clock is right twice a century.
I show them another chart by the Madison Project. This one breaks the GDP hockey stick into regions. As you can see, there are a number of hockey sticks.
Oh, this. I don't really have anything to comment here. I'm just gonna point out to the audience because this is gonna be absolutely hilarious in terms of just how misleading they're trying to present this information to be.
But note that they don't rise at the same time. The United States surged first. Why?
Not quite. You can see others that are surging, not maybe not quite as much as the United States, at least on this graph, but there's others that are also like rising at roughly the same time. And it seems to be, if I'm reading this graph correctly, slightly after 1800.
When your own when you're trying to be an empiricist and the data you present can contradicts your own narrative.
Mm-hmm.
It's particularly pathetic because like from this perspective you could literally like you don't actually have to justify um like that's the problem with empiricism. You don't have to actually justify the principles that you're trying to demonstrate. When you present data and say, "See, this data shows this." Well, the problem is data doesn't really show anything. You could really contextualize it any way that you want. In fact, just depending on like the time that you're measuring or the scale you're measuring, that can drastically change what you're actually even showing. So really, the source of explanatory power for anything is um, is the validity of your axioms, and you can't use data to verify axioms.
Mm-hmm.
It's the other way around. You have to verify your axioms, and then you might be able to present data as a way of maybe like as a way of maybe like showing that your axioms, as a way of trying to present it your axioms in a way that's easy for people to understand. But that's something that you got to do away with. The idea that you can just present a graph and act as though the graph explains what you're trying to argue.
Also,
The
it looks
reason
like there's per line. It looks like there's only like 3 or 4 data points per line.
Yeah, that's the reason why Marxists can point to things like input-output tables or consistent price in labor markets and act as though that's proof that the labor theory of value is valid because they're assuming that it's because they're just assuming their principles, and they're using data to try and conform to those principles, but they're not actually validating those principles. They really can't because I think this goes without saying, but Marx's own economic axioms contradict themselves quite frequently.
Well, I think that's the point. Anyways, let's just see how far this goes.
Well, in a very fortuitous coincidence, the year 1776 witnessed both the signing of our Declaration of Independence and the publication of a book called The Wealth of Nations by the Scottish economist and philosopher Adam Smith. In his book, Smith explained how to create a modern free market capitalist economy and the benefits of doing so.
How to
American
create
Yeah, this is exactly what we were talking about before. A kind of top-down authoritarian understanding of how economies work, and it's just something that you design, you create. It's something that central planners do from their own benevolence that they bestow upon society. It's the same kind of thing that you see with rights that I mentioned earlier, where people could not speak at all until governments came down from heaven and bestowed the right to free speech. And without that, nobody would be able to do any free speech ever. And this is the same thing with a free market capitalist economy and why it's a good thing to do so. It's just simply it needs to be imposed and not at all a spontaneous phenomenon of human interaction as a result of
heretic. Don't
people.
you know that you can't have any of your own interests unless the government exists?
Oh, well, right. Yeah. I forgot. I would never
Because
be able to know anything unless it was a government school that told me it.
because the government formed to in our interests, and our interests couldn't be met unless the government existed.
And Grambo in the chat is asking, who the hell is this guy? I'm assuming he's referring to Adam Smith. He's the one who is credited with coining the term capitalist and being one of the first people to try to promote a narrative that or trying to demonstrate or trying to promote a narrative that promotes a market economy.
Actually, capitalism was originally coined by someone named Thomas Hodgkins, who was a in sort of the same area of thought as Adam Smith at the time, except the difference is that Thomas Hodgkins he was using the term capitalism pejoratively to refer to the sort of privilege created by the state. And Thomas Hodgkins went significantly more in our direction of thinking towards like the Molinaris and the Bastiats of the time, as opposed to the Smiths and Ricardos.
Now, anyways, let's continue.
America's wise founders took Smith's principles to heart, and within a mere 100 years, the
Okay, hold on a second. Our wise founders took Smith's principles to heart. I'm not aware if Adam Smith was doing any sort of writing connect or having any sort of connections with the founding fathers prior to the Declaration of Independence. Now, in all fairness, they were meeting for a pretty significant amount of time before the Declaration of Independence, but I don't believe he had as much of an influence on their thinking and their ideas as, say, Rousseau. What's his name? The guy who wrote the second treatise.
John Locke.
John Locke. Yeah, thank you. I'm terrible with names. as well as crap. I'm forgetting some other guy, some
And
French guy. He wrote
some
the
French
book.
guy doesn't really help me very much.
He wrote a
But okay.
book. He wrote a book called Democracy in America.
Yeah, you're right. I can't think of that off the top of my head. I'm gonna feel like an idiot when I figure out who it is, because I probably know. It's just I'm blanking like you
Yeah,
are.
yeah. The point is that I'd actually be genuinely surprised if Adam Smith really had any influence when just because he published a book at the same year that the Declaration of Independence was published. I just find that rather unbelievable. I,
Published the book the same year that the Declaration of Independence was written, which means that the Declaration of Independence was inspired by that book.
right. Because I know a whole bunch of things that happened around the same year I was born. Clearly, those things that happened around the year I was born result or influence my thinking in some way and influence the kind of person I'm going to be. Yeah, because that makes total sense. I don't know.
I
It was
didn't
like
didn't
was 1770 was the year 1776 like was the planet Earth particularly tiny? Was it like 100 people living in a village and that was the Earth?
my favorite version of that fallacy is everyone who argues that it's a right to own a gun is racist because the NRA also pays lip service to that idea, and the NRA was founded the same year that the Ku Klux Klan was.
I actually had not heard that one yet, but that is like one of the most ridiculous forms of the association fallacy that honestly I've ever heard.
It was that argument was popularized in the Bowling for Columbine movie, and you see that you see remnants of it today when you see Marxian types arguing that the right to own a gun, the Second Amendment, exists because of slave patrols, which doesn't make any sort of sense.
I, I,
But
I'm, I'm quiet because
Marxists were talking about.
I, I'm I'm silent because I'm just trying to wrap my head around these concepts, and I just can't help but wonder. Like whenever I hear something that's particularly stupid, I just wondering if these people just they hear themselves and they have a moment of self awareness where they're just like, wait, what the hell? This is dumb. I don't want to sound dumb.
Well, that's the joy of isolating yourself from competing perspectives and never actually challenging your own ideas. You end up like Thought Slime or Vicky 1999, and it doesn't matter how absolutely retarded what you're saying is. Everybody will tell you that it's great.
I guess
And
so.
as a result, people who are inspired by those ideas build upon them, even though those ideas were flawed or based on an incorrect understanding of something in their conception. And eventually, the philosophical movement dies out because what is actually being articulated becomes so nonsensical and incoherent, no one can follow it.
I guess so. Anyways, I'm continuing. Let's see what else our wise founders did.
And within a mere 100 years, the blink of an eye historically, capitalism turned the United States from 13 backwoods colonies into the world's largest economy, and it's held that position ever since. Western Europe shot up as well, but later. It rose steadily during the Industrial Revolution and then experienced a sharp rise after World War II.
Western Europe. So, not a particular economy in Western Europe, Britain, France, Germany, just Western Europe.
Yeah, I guess so. Although this is very strange because I know historically, like around the 19th century, the economy of Europe include I'm saying Europe in aggregates, but it's mostly places like Germany or at the time Prussia, the UK, or at the time England, France. They were all relatively laissez-faire in the sense that the extent of government intervention in the economy, especially compared to today, was relatively minimal. So they kind of shoot themselves in the foot here by trying to make this argument because Western Europe, I know I'm making the aggregate argument here, but I think I made a decent case as to why, was actually a lot freer in the time between 1800 to 1880. So I don't understand where the hell they're getting their I I don't know where the hell they're getting this belief that Europe became more freer after World War II when we can clearly demonstrate that arguably the opposite happened because World War II ended with the triumph of central planning technocratic globalism.
Yeah, if like Soviet style state socialism had become dominant in Western Europe, contrasted with mercantilism, where literally the state was trying to choke out any sort of association occurring at the time, you would have probably ended up with like similar GDP charts.
Mm-hmm. And this is another way in which the chart is completely misleading because it's completely ignoring the historical context of the relatively laissez-faire period in European history. And it really begs the question how GDP per capita, let alone GDP at all, would have been calculated at the time. Especially considering, like, I can't imagine that a government as laissez-faire as what Prussia had in the early to mid 18 or in the early mid to late 1800s that they would have been counting as much economic activity that would have resulted in their economy seeming less prosperous than it actually was.
But yeah, I guess going back to what we were talking about in the beginning of the stream, why I care so much about this and why I would argue, or at least why I assume you do as well, is because I think that bad arguments for a position do more damage to that position than arguments against that position, especially if the position in question is something that really doesn't have any powerful retorts to it. So that's why I've become a bit more concerned with like statist conservatives over time, or like party political libertarians, because I think that a bad argument in favor of libertarianism or anarchy, um, or free market economic theory is something that should be more concerned in it. There's a big problem because we've been met largely, not largely, but from a lot of these political types, um, we've been treated essentially as though criticizing not very compelling arguments for these particular subjects, as though that's equivalent to taking a like anti-property view, which is just absurd.
Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to. Let's keep going because I had a thought, but then I lost it.
Oh, okay.
Anyways, continuing.
That describes me a
End of
couple
the
of
war
times
and the mid
here.
1960s, it fully embraced the free market.
Western Europe embracing the free market. I mean, first off, they still haven't defined what Western Europe is, and secondly, I'm genuinely surprised that they would say that 1960s German or 1960s Western Germany or that 1960s England anyway resembled a free market.
Well, given that apparently his understanding of embracing a free market is just governments not being mercantilist anymore. It's a pretty low bar to meet in terms of descriptive requirements.
I mean, I'm very curious if he would consider universal healthcare, or rather the UK's national healthcare, to be a free market policy. Because, that was pretty common in Western Europe at the time, and still is.
Anyway, continuing.
Yeah.
Japan too shot up after World War II, surpassing Western Europe for the first time, after the U.S. helped the Japanese transition to a democracy and a free market capitalist economy.
That's a fun. That's a funny way of saying the U.S. government went in and established their central bank for them as a way to launder money into their Southeast Asian drug cartels. Because that's what they did. For anyone who's read the Phoenix program, if you haven't, I'd recommend reading that book or just more specifically the documents detailing the Phoenix program specifically. But yeah, the history between the U.S. and Japan was is basically the relationship between between a drug cartel and some shady political actor, that's allowing them to launder funds through them.
I mean, Japan throughout the post-war history had basically two stages. First off, they had a central bank which not only centralized their currency but also allowed them to just pump money into their economy through a loose monetary system that allowed them to did genuine create a lot of prosperity and growth. But as you might imagine, that prosperity and growth was built on incredibly shaky foundations, which of course collapsed in the 80s, and they've been in a zombie economy ever since, trying to lurch forward to grab onto whatever vestiges of the greatness that they had in the past, which they simply cannot get anymore because they've run their economy into the ground. And nowadays, like, the living standards are absolutely horrendous, where people, in order to simply make ends meet, have to work 16-hour days, and it's absolutely just wretched. If this is apparently that's the cost of prosperity, I guess, to these people.
Well, and that sort of gets back to what we've been saying throughout the stream. Prosperity for the political economy does not necessarily, and in fact, in most cases, actually entails antagonizing the interests of the non-political actors actually living in those economies.
Mm-hmm.
When you hear conservatives give pushing that sort of Buckleyite pull yourself up by the bootstraps line of arguing, even within that sort of argument, even within that sort of framework, typically an example of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps is going to college and getting a license from the state to go into a particularly politically connected field of work.
Yay, going to state approved universities and laundering money towards the politically connected. That sounds like a wonderful
So
idea.
even according to their own argumentation, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps is basically just a euphemism for bow down and accept the state as your new master.
Mm-hmm. Anyways, let's continue.
Eastern Europe
Whoop.
Eastern Europe took off after it was released from the Soviet Union and socialism in 1991. China did likewise after the Chinese moved away from strict socialism and implemented some limited free market policies.
Now, this part I found particularly hilarious because take a look at where the graph represents when they apparently dropped strict socialism and went into limited free market policies. 1950. 1950. Isn't that about the time that Mao came to power and run the Chinese and won the Chinese Civil War?
Yeah, that literally is the start of the Communist Party of China establishing its regime in China. I don't think the specific year was 1950, But what the graph is going on to measure goes well into 2001, which includes definitely does include Mao Zedong's rise to power.
I don't know if I can make it any more clear that this graph is absolutely freaking terrible.
Well, it also proves the point that I was arguing just a moment ago, where in comparison to feudalism, you could make the exact same argument about Soviet-style state socialism. If you were to plot that on a graph in comparison to a mercantilist economy, you would get a similar result to the effects of the Industrial Revolution as it actually happened.
Yeah. I'm curious as to see if they're going to cite India and Africa too. This whole graph is just. I don't know if we can emphasize anymore just how terrible it is. Just at least try to insert more data points to have a more
To
clear
make it
picture.
even make it a bit more clear what I'm arguing, if we lived in an alternate timeline where instead of I guess liberalizing the global political economy, if you want to call it that, uh, if instead of that, um, the transition from mercantilism was towards a state socialist political economy. The conservatives of the modern day would be pointing to that and arguing in favor of that on these same grounds.
Yeah, I can see that. Anyways, continuing.
It's not a meaningful defense of any sort of free market principles because you could use literally the exact same argument to defend state socialism.
Anyways, continuing.
One can only imagine where China would be now if its leaders had fully unleashed the forces of the free market. Yes,
It's you see the free market is just something that leaders just need to unleash. It's something that is entirely up to their arbitrary discretion to just
Impose onto society.
this I don't we've talked about this before several times on the stream in fact, but I just can't help but find it remarkable in that they hear the words that come out of their mouth. Do they even have a moment to think about the idea or the kind of double think that is absolutely necessary to believe that freedom is something that needs to be imposed from the top down?
Chairman Prager says that the Chinese government from the 50s to the 70s was free market, but not fully free market. In order to be fully free market, the tax rate during the anti-rightist struggle should have been 5% less.
I guess so. Yeah, that actually makes perfect sense. Yes, I'm convinced. Anyways, continuing.
this period of economic expansion, the wealthy got wealthier. That always happens when new wealth is created. But the middle class and the poor also greatly benefited. Here's another telling chart. This one is from the World Bank. In 1820, 94% of people lived in extreme poverty.
Now, this is going to be very interesting because you know how poverty and extreme poverty are measurements that are arbitrarily defined.
Yeah, the
So,
goalpost keeps shifting because the implications of scarcity keep changing.
the cost of living keeps changing, and even ignoring completely temporal states, it's going to change from region to region, where people who live in poverty in some places, if they took all of their wealth and assets to a country with a lower standard of living, or rather a lower cost of living, they would actually live like kings. I think a while ago, in a much older stream, I was talking about how in the 1930s, when the Weimar Republic and Austria were experiencing hyperinflation, that there were homeless people in England who would live full time in like penthouses in high end Austrian hotels simply because they could afford to. Homeless people, mind you. So God knows what people who would be living in extreme poverty in, say, the United States would be able to do if, say, would be able to afford in, say, Venezuela.
Well, keep in mind also, I don't know if you read like Proudhon describing his upbringing, but he actually was in like a what would have been considered in the early 1800s to be like a lower middle class French household. And at the time, what that meant was literally having a dirt floor and not being able to afford shoes. And if somebody didn't, if somebody who was making income in the household didn't go to work one day, that there is a legitimate chance that that could mean somebody starved in that house.
Mm-hmm.
So that, and that's not even, that wouldn't have even been considered extreme poverty at the time.
Yeah.
So extreme poverty though is an arbitrary metric. I guess extreme poverty was just being literally dead. So, uh, but at least according to how the states used to measure it. But yeah, this is actually completely contrary to how you're supposed to approach this study because, as I was sort of hinting at earlier, with new developments, what increasing wealth actually means is for more people to have more access to more resources and be able to use them in an increasingly varied number of ways to an increasingly varied number of ends. So, properly understood, the question that you should be asking is not is why does wealth exist, not why does poverty exist, because as Per Byland or Sheldon Richman have both put it pretty aptly, the human species, the natural state of the human species or human civilization is poverty because that's what we started with. We started with absolutely nothing.
Mm-hmm. And, well, these people are not going to have any idea where wealth actually comes from or even how it's created. It's just a thing that somehow happens as a spontaneous phenomenon of our leaders imposing freedom upon us.
The state threatened us into prosperity just the right way.
Mm-hmm. I guess it's like a piano where if you press if you press keys at random, you're just going to end up with noise. But if you press them in the correct sequence, you can create something that's absolutely beautiful. And it's the same way with government violence. They just have to use the right amount of force in the right amount of in the right way, and then something beautiful happens.
But going back to the argument that's being put forward in this video, something that's with that understanding, there's a reason why the government doesn't push that idea of understanding why wealth exists, because if you did that, well, then these models that all these mainstream academics create to try and justify these state programs, the burden, the it would insist upon explaining their axioms if that was the assumption everybody made going into the study. Because it's not enough to just, it wouldn't be enough to just create a model. It would be, you'd have to explain how that applies to the study of markets or whether or not it even can. That would invalidate like 90 to 95% of all mainstream by mainstream I mean political academia. That would invalidate 90 to 95% of pretty much everything that they put forward, because somewhere along the way they wouldn't be able to explain their methodology, because that's everyone other than the Austrians basically just starts from the assumption that economies in some way are prescribed by the state. If not the resources that are, being traded and the incentives people have to trade those resources, then the framework which people trade their resources within. That's what like the monetarists would argue is, they're not completely off into La La Land where they think that like central planning, at least of resources themselves, is valid, but they do believe in central planning in the sense that, from their perspective, if you didn't have like a central bank or a monopoly on security, then you wouldn't be able to defend property, or you wouldn't be able to actually invest assets.
Hmm. And someone in the comments just asked about the Gravel Institute. We know we're going to get that eventually.
Yeah, I don't know if we're gonna stream a response to them or whether or not we should just make like a video replying to a couple of their videos. Pardon the redundancy, but yeah, I'm sort of that's kind of where I am at the moment. I don't know what the best way to approach them would be.
Well, last you talked to me about it, you said you were just going to make one video replying to their entire breadth of content, since we all know that they're just going to be touching on
Yeah.
the same subjects over and over again, and so an overarching reply to the philosophy that they're demonstrating would be, at least in your opinion, the best way to approach that. I mean, I don't disagree. I'm just recalling what I heard.
Yeah, but I mean, after that video, I'd imagine that they're not gonna stop making content because the best agorist floofer completely took their breath away. But yeah, I think that there will be some streamed responses to them for sure.
Probably in the future. Anyways, I'm going to continue here.
Thanks to capitalism, by 2015, that number declined to 9.6%, single digits for the first time in human history. Now, it's still too many, but if we're going to reduce the number,
You know, we can reduce the number of people living in extreme poverty tomorrow. All we have to do is just
That
change
is
the
the
way
thing.
extreme poverty is counted to say like anyone who has assets under $0 in when converted into U.S. currency is going to be considered to be living in extreme poverty. Oh, and by the way, we're counting body parts as assets as well.
Yeah,
So
you're not in extreme poverty because you still have both your arms. What are you complaining about?
that kidney is worth $15,000 on the black market. So you could probably sell one of those and get yourself out of extreme poverty pretty quickly. Or just simply having it because it counts as an asset means that you have a net worth of at least $15,000 plus a good chunk of the rest of your organs, which are going to be probably worth up to five, if not six figures in total, probably even seven. And as a
It,
result, like literally
it
nobody would be living in extreme poverty. So because we change
wouldn't
how
even be
statistics are counted,
like
we've reduced poverty to zero.
wouldn't even be that. It would be like go to one of our state hospitals and we can chop up your body and kill you, and we might give you we might give your family 10% of what we make off your organs. That's the future that we would be heading towards if it wasn't for the fact that the state is about to collapse as is.
That would actually not surprise me. Then anyway, it's kind of a hyperbolic example, but it showcases how absolutely ridiculous and arbitrary the idea of measuring extreme poverty is. Anyways, I'm just continuing here.
number even more, we need to understand what caused the decline. Free market capitalism. If we combine the Angus Madison hockey stick chart and the World Bank data on extreme poverty, what we get is something quite amazing. Unprecedented global prosperity and an unprecedented decline in poverty.
Congratulations,
Yeah,
you've merged two completely arbitrary graphs together, and they created, I guess that's an hourglass shape.
Yeah, the other reason why why the state is absolutely terrified of measuring based on the assumption of what creates wealth, other than it forcing them to explain their axioms, is that if they do that, the question that people would naturally ask is not what sort of policies can the state use to engineer these incentives. The natural question would be, well, what would we have to get out of the market in order for people to be able to use resources more effectively? And since you can't I think very few people would come away with the conclusion that there are some sort of natural incentives that would just have to be done away with, because that's not even really a coherent idea in concept. Most people would walk away with the conclusion that these licensing schemes have to be done away with, or the sort of these standards like corporate law or copyright law, which privilege some actors at the expense of others, or dare I say, the entire political economy itself.
Well, no, we can't have that. We can't get rid of the entire political economy because if we get rid of the state, who else is going to impose freedom onto us? Ha, you didn't think about that, did you, silly anarchist? Without the government, who's going to give us freedom?
Our covenant communities.
Oh,
That's the
crap.
political libertarian answer.
Oh, crap, that's right. Yeah, I forgot. We forgot to give our praises and thanks to Lord Hop for the knowledge of covenant communities so that we can have stateless states and
Stateless states.
that can impose freedom slavery onto us.
Are stateless governments that will put us in camps for having the wrong opinions
And
or associating the wrong way.
and for having the wrong thoughts. Hey, let's go to. I want to go to, or hey, let's go out to eat, but I don't know what we should eat. How about we all vote on it and we decide where we're going to go? Sound fair? Great. Oh no, I'm going to Freedom Jail because I decided to put up where we're going to eat up for a vote. God, the whole thing is just ridiculous. Anyways, continuing.
Yeah.
Across the globe over the past 200 years. That's capitalism in a nutshell. One more chart.
That's an acorn.
A nutshell.
That's an acorn. Acorns are not nuts. I don't think they're nuts.
Acorns don't have shells. They're literally seeds for trees.
Nutshell. One more chart. Johan Norberg, a Swedish economic historian, shows us how well ordinary people do when they work in a free market economy. Since 1990, hunger, poverty, illiteracy, and child mortality have all declined significantly with the decline of socialism.
That only goes back to 1990, which I don't know if that's. Has there been any significant decline in socialism since 1990 that I'm not aware of?
Considering that to these people, socialism is the opposite of capitalism, I don't think that you could argue that because that's an equally useless description of certain economic perspectives.
I'm trying to make sense of this graph. Like, what does the Y chart mean? Percent 1990 equals 100, and then it's like 10, 20, 30. What the hell is that measuring?
Yeah, your graph doesn't even make sense.
Can chat?
It's 100% socialism.
I know the chat's 20 minutes or 20 seconds behind, but I'm hoping someone can help us make sense of this chart, because as it stands to reason, it looks like in 1990 there was 100% hunger, poverty, illiteracy, and child mortality.
This is why you don't This is why you can't measure ethical consistency or economic models by percentages. It just doesn't make any fucking sense.
Yeah, right now I'm just stalling for time for chat to get through the 20 seconds. But
At least in terms of economic models, you'd have to, I guess, explain what exactly it is that you're arguing before you just present these sort of baseless percentages.
what the? I'm just gonna go forward a little bit because it maybe the animation isn't finished loading.
This all happened while we added 2 billion to socialism. Child mortality have all declined significantly.
No, they weren't. Oh God. What the hell? Like, I,
What?
I just skipped forward in the video a little bit just to see if like there was more. There was like an animation that wasn't finished loading that would like some text that would contextualize what the Y chart means. But no, it just goes right into a very vague explanation about
Progress.
like what.
Progress.
Right,
what
right.
is progress? Progress is asking what I mean by progress is a socialist question. You're not a socialist, are you?
No, I'm not a socialist. I swear. I swear, community covenant officer. I swear I'm not a socialist.
Yeah, this is. I don't even really know where to begin here because it's not even really clear what's being claimed. Yeah, the person narrating the video said, "We've progressed since the decline of socialism," but literally nothing about that statement. You know, it makes it more clear what's being argued.
Uh, uh, I don't know what it's that like. I think I'm starting to figure it out. It's sort of
What
like
makes it?
if they're trying to. I think I'm starting to figure out what it means, actually. And that is, they've frozen the rates of hunger, poverty, illiteracy, and child mortality at 1990, such that they don't actually tell us what that rate is at the time, but they're trying to demonstrate that over time as a percentage of what it was at 1990, that there is now 60% of hunger in 2015, I think. So it's like a comparative thing.
Yeah, well, that's the sort of and I don't necessarily know if I went over this specifically, but there's, that's sort of an inherent problem in trying to like compare freedom. One place being more free than another, comparatively, in the same way that you can like compare one area's taxes to another. It doesn't really work because ethical principle. So it's consistent regardless of what the state is doing. The question is always, I guess the question is always, do people have the ability to actually defend their rights? And do people, can it be, can the ability for one person to demonstrate their rights, um, can that be a consistently achievable thing? And in any state society, that's not the case because the state's existence means that one group's monopolized security.
hmm I just think that this is just a terrible chart. I'm kind of fixated on it right now. I do apologize, but it's like I think I figured it out, but it's like it's so confusing that I just can't. I just can't. Should we just continue?
Sure, I guess.
With the decline of socialism. This all happened while we added 2 billion more people to the world. Far more people, far less poverty, better health outcomes, fewer babies dying.
For some reason, my mind went to seeing that list and kind of imagining some parody of it on a on a one of those PragerU YouTube poops where he lists out he makes that list for
Yeah.
more people, fewer people dying, fewer babies dying, fewer people in poverty, and then it cuts to Dennis Prager saying, "This would drive me mad." Those are always hilarious.
I think my favorite is that out of context PragerU Twitter account, and one of the screenshots they posted was a white person next to a black person, and it said superior above the white person.
I don't remember that one. The video that everyone has to watch is Dennis Prager Reloaded. It's just that one is just phenomenally well done. It's very well edited. My favorite part is when it goes like you hear Dennis Prager's voice saying like, "Babies, they're not good, but I'm hungry." Yeah, I'm sorry. My mind's in the gutter right now, I think. Anyways, let's.
Comes fewer babies dying. That's what economic freedom, capitalism can do.
I mean, there's not much really to say about that we haven't already said.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to it.
All right.
By the way, we're making fun of Hoppians earlier. Still haven't heard anything from the contributors at Hoppians.org, despite them agreeing to come on the stream and have a debate with us. You know, we've given you guys our Discord tags. Haven't we should? I'm waiting, but
Yeah, if you're having trouble, if you're for some reason having trouble finding us, you can go ahead and leave a comment in one of the videos, preferably not on this channel because honestly, I'm not going to be checking comments on this channel. So if you want to leave one in, say, one of the Backalley videos, we'll probably be able to find it a lot more quickly. But yeah, just let us know when you want to come on, and yeah, we can start talking then. Even if you just want to send us like create a Discord server that we can join, and then send us an invite, that would also work. Plenty of options available. Anyways, let's just hit continue.
President John Kennedy, a Democrat, said it best. While making his case for significant tax cuts in 1963, he said a rising tide lifts all boats. Kennedy didn't believe that the poor only get richer when the rich get poorer. He believed everyone could get richer with economic growth. History has shown that he was right. This whole capitalism versus socialism debate is backwards. It's not those who advocate for free market capitalism who need to justify their actions. Rather, it's those advocating for socialism or any form of it who have a lot of explaining to do. I'm Andy Puster for...
And yeah, the video is pretty much over at this point.
yeah,
I just saw the picture you posted. Should I post it into
yeah, you show it on the stream.
All right, this will probably take a minute.
All right, but
no, never mind. I got it. I didn't mean to do that actually, but I got it.
in terms of the point that the Prager, the presenter for PragerU, admittedly I already forgot his name, but that could just be me being like potato brained and tired right now. But yeah, as for the point that he was making towards the end of the video, well, I think that's probably one of the most dangerous mentalities you can be in, not just for the studies of societies or markets, but just like in general when it comes to making claims about the natural world. The idea that you don't have to justify your assumptions, even if what you're arguing is correct, and I would agree that you're correct, you still have, because I think you're right doesn't mean you're right. And if you have an argument against someone else's position, that doesn't necessarily validate your position. What you need to do, you need to explain what you mean by things like property. need to explain. You need to actually set some tangible parameters for your principles so that they can actually be used to point to certain aspects of reality and make claims about what those things are and explain why they're more valid than competing attempts to approach that subject. Because otherwise, you could be saying virtually the same, you could be paying lip service to the same ideals that like Heretic and I are, but you could find yourself in a position where what we're arguing are, night and day. You're a proponent of the state's political economy while paying lip service to free market ideals, yet, there's literally, if you're going to actually look at the specific principles in terms of studying markets, not really relative to ethics, there's no way that you could reconcile the conflict between the starting from the assumption that you're literally, in order to have an economy, you literally need to prescribe it through the use of violence onto society, and observing society as a series of exchanges between people within any given communities. Um, so I think that, I guess, in conclusion, this is more fundamentally why I think bad arguments against state socialism or any sort of planning or for the quote unquote free market are more dangerous to libertarianism or like Austrian ideals than promoters of the contrary position. And that's why the state doesn't honestly ever approach our ideas in any meaningful sense through the mainstream outlets of debate, if they even try to talk about our ideals. Like they're scared to death of even mentioning agorism, because agorism, since it's inherently anti-political, it has one special characteristic to it, which is it can't be subverted. But yeah, they're scared to death of ever honestly representing libertarian philosophy, because even if they shit all over it, if they were to honestly represent it, it means that they have to actually approach. It means they have to actually approach what libertarians are arguing against the state, and as Heretic, I and many other libertarians have shown, there is no rational case for the state.
Sorry if I'm giggling randomly. I have that picture up on stream. You can see people in the chat replying to it. It's
I I don't even know what video that's from. It's presumably it's just like some video paraphrasing like the what's being represented as the anti-conservative position. That's typically what the posts consist of on the no context PragerU account. It's but still, it's hilarious.
yeah. I don't follow. I'm not on Twitter, so I don't follow PragerU out of context. But I'm sure it's if we can get more stuff like this, I'd be happy to put it on stream, because this is just yeah, this is freaking hilarious. So, though someone in the chat asked if I put it on because they were there, they being, I'm just assuming here, they're black. And I can assure you, it's not out of any racism or racist malice on my part. I find racist humor funny, and SO shared that with me, and I thought it would be funny to put it on stream. So yeah, that's why. Should I post this one up too?
Yeah, sure. Pretty great.
Alright, give me a minute here.
Sounds like something that would be on fucking Memory TV.
It It probably would be. Give me a second here. It opened in the wrong tab. There we go. Now this one is not quite as funny simply because I know the context of it. But yeah, sorry, we're just gonna be laughing at PragerU for the next couple minutes. But yeah, in regards to PragerU, I mean, I completely agree that these ideas that pretend to be friendly to the ideas that you and I present are even more dangerous than oppositional ideas, because it drives people who would otherwise be sympathetic to agorism or just simply market anarchism in general towards beliefs that they assume agree with us and agree with their underlying beliefs that would make them susceptible to our opinions, but it also drives them into fundamentally anti-market, anti-freedom ideas and assumptions that ultimately just lead to more statism, more state dominion, and a belief that somehow these things are legitimate, these things are good, these things are necessary even, which goes without saying that if you believe that freedom is something that needs to be imposed onto society, therefore, if you don't have something to impose it, like say a state, then you can't have freedom at all. It's easy for people to come to that assumption, and I think that's also a good reason as to why a lot of people, when presented with actual principled anarchism, their belief is that it would result in tyranny because there is no overarching authority that can just impose freedom upon them. It's very difficult for a lot of people, especially those who were indoctrinated in government institutions, to realize that freedom is a spontaneous a spontaneous phenomenon of human interaction. It's fundamentally not in
Actually,
people's interests to oppress one another. The only reason it is because a lot of lying sociopaths a long time ago found out that it's ridiculously profitable, and we've been stuck with the curse of Socrates ever since.
Actually, I think that like the image that pops into their heads, and I have actually reason to believe this, but I think that the reason a lot of people argue that it's not that they don't think freedom they don't necessarily think freedom is something that has to be imposed. It's that they think societies fundamentally are defined by political fiat. So if you're suggesting that we're going to have a society without a state, what comes into their head is we're suggesting the state should just there is no way to establish an infrastructure without the state prescribing it. So and we're just suggesting the state tomorrow disbanding and there being no sort, without it, uh, we just think it would be a good idea for there to be, or we think that it's even feasible that there could be a society without any sort of fundamental infrastructure, because infrastructure equals politics equals state, according to them. So that this is why when we're talking about the types that we're referring to here, when we're talking to them, a common argument that they unironically put forward, and they literally are incapable of seeing the problem with, is like, if the U.S. government became an anarchy, China would just invade. They don't understand, though, that the libertarian conclusion is making it impossible for a government to exist by subverting the ability for political means to influence society. So in reality, that couldn't happen, because for the same reason that in such a scenario the U.S. government wouldn't exist, another government wouldn't be able to come along and impose itself onto the society. In fact, more than likely, China, if the Chinese government wasn't already about to collapse because of counter-economic subversion, it would be incapable of invading any stateless territory for the sheer fact that the libertarians would be subverting the Chinese government the same way that they subverted the U.S. government, or at least an infrastructure created by libertarians.
And you can be absolutely
So,
certain that any technology that the libertarians have here that would allow us to be able to subvert the American government would also be shared with Hong Kong protesters and Chinese libertarians to subvert their own government. And as such, well, that problem is only going to get worse when if China even attempts to invade because, well, as you said, the same people who subverted the U.S. government are going to have no problem at all and no issue in relating to their conscience with subverting and undermining the Chinese government. And they're going to they're going to find that they're going to find out something that Europe figured out hundreds of years ago, that imperialism is fundamentally unprofitable. But you know what? Want to know what's even less profitable than imperialism? Imperialism on countries that are fundamentally state hostile economically. Well, I mean, I guess that's something that they need to figure out on their own, isn't it? I for one, I for one don't foresee any situation where we could possibly lose.
no, and I've seriously, I've taken it into consideration, and I've been actually thinking about that more so than I am just sort of the explanations of how the state's invalid, and that's kind of how I came to the conclusion. That's how I came to the sort of Aristotelian conclusion where ethical outcomes are entailments of actions we've taken to make sure there's something that can be enforced in society. Not enforced, but people can defend them readily. And seeing the state as an obstacle to ethical conclusions being realized and being defended. It just because if not only does that view make more sense just from sort of the perspective of observing social what ethics are in relation to social interactions, and also just in terms of what actually the libertarians are arguing when it comes to the state, that conclude. I've been thinking about specifically how to undermine the state, uh, starting from that mentality. I have, once you start from the perspective of Aristotelian logic, what becomes more interesting, what becomes incentivized, I guess, is to analyze specifically the incentives or interests of the state. So I've taken it into consideration, and I would agree with Heretic. I see libertarianism at this point, the libertarian conclusion. It's something that exists innately, and what we've seen over time is gradually a degradation of the state's ability to impose itself onto society.
Mm-hmm.
What we're seeing is basically the evolution into a libertarian society, and I think properly understood, that's the correct way to look at it. It's
Mm-hmm.
not that doesn't mean though that you sit back and that you should sit back and not do anything. Actually, you would be incentivized in getting in on counter economies early, because the sooner that you get all your assets out of the legal market, the less risk there is imposed onto you by the threat of other people pulling all their assets out of the legal market.
Well, what's
You know,
gonna end up?
once all your assets are counter economic, when the political economy collapses, you're not going to be affected at all, or you'll be the effects it'll have on you are minimal compared to what it would on somebody who has all their assets in a bank or is going through college.
Yeah, what you want to do is, well, there's several things you can do, but I boil it down to two categories. One, getting out of the white market ensures that as the state ensures that, well, you're more protected. As the state is going to find its ability to fund itself continually undermined, they're going to be incentivized to become more predatory and more victimizing of your rights. So you can imagine things like increased regulatory burdens on your assets, on your ability to produce and consume in the white market, in addition to any sort of white market employment you will do, will undoubtedly become significantly harder to do, while at the same time your pay will go down, either because your employer is required to pay you less, is paying you less, or simply because your income tax is going up. In addition to the fact that, well, any assets you may have in savings in a bank is probably going to be taxed. Interest rates probably going to become non-existent, if not outright negative, and at that point you're actually losing money by having your savings in a bank at all. So what you want to have happen is get out of that white market, and by getting into gray and black markets, you're able to, for lack of a better term, get in under the growth industries, places where the economy is actually starting to move towards. And by arranging yourself in such a way, not only are you able to earn an income that is stable and safe from the predations of governments, but you're also able to really get in, start building a reputation with people in a time period that is going to be, or in a time period in the future where reputation is going to be significantly more valuable. So think about it as like an investment for the future, as well as a protection of your assets. So there are very good reasons not to just sit back, and just let agorism and let libertarianism just destroy the white market, because there are going to be growing pains. There are going to be a lot of growing pains, and what you're going to be seeing is a lot of the turmoil and a lot of the chaos that accompanied the Industrial Revolution, which took place over centuries, compressed into basically your lifetime. So you're going to want to take measures to protect yourself, become knowledgeable about what's coming, what's going to happen, and how the state is going to respond to it. And at the bare minimum, you can at least put yourself in a situation where you are better off than most of the people around you. And even if you can do that alone, you'll automatically be put in a better position. Of course, the simplest measure that I think everyone can take is buying both precious metals as well as cryptocurrency. If you can do that, if you can transfer your savings into those assets, you're certainly going to be in a far better position, especially as the dollar starts to enter free fall. I mean, I'm seeing story after story after story about billionaire after billionaire after billionaire who have made all of these like ridiculous predictions about Bitcoin becoming ridiculously profitable, as well as precious metals. So honestly, the time to buy precious metals was yesterday, but it's still not too late. And the same goes for cryptocurrency, because right now they are starting to shoot up. Bitcoin actually reached 13,000 again, and a whole bunch of others are really skyrocketing at this point. I know that Litecoin went over 50 again. That's very good.
Yes, it is.
So with this in mind, like, yeah, now's the time to buy was yesterday, but you can still do it. There's still going to be plenty of time, but as you might imagine, that window is going to be closing.
Yeah, keep in mind though, what I was what Heretic was saying earlier. It's not, it'll happen regardless of whether or not you participate in the counter market. I guess prior, because other people will be doing so out of sheer economic necessity. But yeah, if you don't want to have a difficult time adjusting to the free decentralized networking that'll exist in the post-state society, then I'd suggest getting some assets that you actually have a decent amount of you have a decent amount of influence over, or just assets like that are pretty sound in their economic value due to the utility that they have. Like gold would be a good example, I guess. Yeah, get leave your white market job. Try and get as much money out of your banks as possible, and try to associate in your local areas with people um, for mutual benefit between you.
Hmm.
That's how you start off prosperous in the stateless society.
Hmm. And of course, be very alert as to a lot of changes that are going to be coming about in the near future. Because I'm going to make my own prediction about what's coming, and that is that it's going to that the cultural attitudes for how one achieves prosperity are going to be largely inverse of what they were in the Dark Ages. I talked about this in the Hoppian video, and I think it's worth reiterating that in the Dark Ages, you had cultural attitudes, cultural conservatism that was largely selective against people. What would be the proper term? That was selected against people trading or trading in ways that were experimental, and they wanted people to just like try to use the time-tested, proven methods of maintaining their society, maintaining their traditions, that sort of thing, because they were all sustenance farmers. It was a time period in which experimentation did mean the possibility of a marginal improvement in your standard of living, but considering that people had to work basically all the time just to not starve to death, experimentation, if it didn't work, meant death. And as such, you had a whole lot of cultural attitudes that were selected against experimentation, if not outright hostile to it. I think the inverse is going to be important in the future. Not necessarily that the cultural attitudes will select against conservatism and be hostile to it, but rather that cultural attitudes will be very favorable towards experimentation, new ideas, and that sort of thing. So just if you're not able to be adaptable today to changing circumstances, changing ideas, and new things, then you should at least begin to train yourself to be, because I think that's going to become very important in the not too distant future. But to put it simply, adaptability is going to be a virtue in the not too distant future.
All right. Well, is that it for today's stream?
Yeah, I think that's it.
All right. So I guess we'll be maybe responding to a Gravel Institute video in Friday's stream. They seem to be pretty short, and it would be fun to do that after doing Prager U in the middle of the week, because they're basically the same thing, just pandering to different political allegiances.
Yeah,
So
it's like
what was that?
I was just gonna say like Gravel Institute is just like a Chinese bootleg of PragerU.
As though PragerU is of any sort of quality to begin with.
Well,
But um,
I mean,
but
it's like it's like Microsoft is a very low quality product as it is, but the Chinese still managed to knock it off anyway with
Michael Soft
Microsoft Windows, which I'm pretty sure is not actually a software company. I'm pretty sure it's just like a computer repair shop, but it's still just yeah. The Gravel Institute is basically just the Microsoft Windows of PragerU. And if anyone can come up with any arguments otherwise, please change my mind. But other than that, yeah, that's going to be the end of this stream. So, you got anything left to say?
No, I said everything I wanted to in the stream.
All right. Well, thanks for stopping by, everyone, and we'll see you next time.